Hello, welcome to the Lions Awaken show. Glad to have you guys with us today. Me, Matthew Detweiler, your host, with your co-host
Caleb Havanka.
Today's topic, we're going to talk a little bit about American history, and what better way to learn about American history and the Pilgrims' journey here to America, what America looks like today compared to their vision from 12th and 13th generation direct descendants from William Bradford. Today we have with us David Bradford and his son Aaron Bradford. And thank you guys for being on our show and willing to share your heart with us. Appreciate that.
Our pleasure.
An honor to be here.
It's so good to have you guys here. You guys are dressed really fine. You guys represent the patriotic spirit and the history of America very well. I met Aaron last year at the Wormslow Historic Site in Savannah, Georgia. Me and my wife went down there to visit, and he did a reenactment of, I'm not sure, a militia of some sort in a war, and he was very entertaining. He made history really come alive, and so we just really connected. And Aaron loves the Lord, as well as his father here. They love the Lord. They love America. They are fighting for it. They're actually putting together a mini series called the 1620 Experience that will be aired, I believe, next month. They're going to talk more about that, as well as what Aaron does with Liberty Encounters. So thank you guys so much for being on here. I'm excited to hear from you guys. David, if you just want to share first kind of what you do and
Sure.
tell people a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm 67 years old. I'm the age that William Bradford was when he died. So
Oh, wow.
I'm bringing the much later perspective.
It's
Aaron and I
continuing
have
on
both-
his legacy.
Yeah, well, Aaron and I have both been very interested in our family history and in personal history for basically all of Aaron's life, I know. And when we homeschooled the boys, and I have 4 boys, and Aaron's the oldest, and we went up to Plymouth. We always go to the places where you want to learn history. And I think a lot of that has helped instill sort of an appreciation for our American heritage and what God has done in our country. And so we've always felt sort of I think Aaron can speak for himself. I think you were about 12 when you kind of realized that Governor Bradford was such an important figure in American history. And then I've always had sort of a desire when I retired and got old enough, I could actually share Governor Bradford's history. He was the one that wrote so prolifically. Most of what we know about the Pilgrims comes from his journal of Plymouth Plantation, and also Edward Winslow's accounts he had 2 accounts he wrote about the early Pilgrims. So most of the firsthand account of what we know about the Pilgrim history comes from Bradford. So I always wanted to make it come to life, and I thought, what better way than to share in his own words what he painstakingly and what God inspired him to sit down and log this history in a 20-year period from 1630 to 1650 is when he really documented and wrote down. He was really our first historian. So I always thought, and if you've ever read Plymouth Plantation, you will probably find it's a little bit challenging. Some of the language, he writes long sentences, and he wrote in the third person, where he's like a reporter sharing what God's doing through these people. So he was sort of a independent, objective observer. It wasn't a personal diary. He didn't give personal accounts so much as he was sharing the history of what God did through them. And so when you read it, he's talking they and them, and you reread these sentences. I want to know what this is saying, and you kind of struggle to have to read it again and again to understand it. It was only when I put it into the first person, I took the liberty of taking his journal and certain segments of it. I instead of they and them, I'd go, if I was sharing this as William Bradford, I would say we and I and them. And once you made that little adjustment, the whole text just came to life. It was like I would find myself repeatedly going, wow, that's what he's saying. Oh man, this is amazing. And it was so powerful that we just felt this was, for me, it's sort of I hope to do this as long as the Lord gives me clarity of thought and gives me breath. I want to share this with people to really understand and appreciate what God put on Bradford's heart to share about what they did, why they did it. We don't have to speculate like a lot of secular historians and people have done. We can go right to his account and he can tell us exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. So that's been just how I've gotten into this, and that's what I do now. And we could talk more about our project, which is really trying to relate this to what's going on in our world today.
Could you just kind of educate us and our viewers on like who exactly was William Bradford? Like
Sure.
A little bit more, just some more detail of who he was, the man.
Yes. I just was up in Plymouth for the American Pilgrimage 400 earlier this week, actually Sunday through Wednesday. And
this might sound like sorry to interrupt you, but this might sound like an uneducated question, but where is Plymouth? Is that in Virginia?
No, Plymouth, Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
Yeah,
Okay.
Cape Cod. That's where the Mayflower landed.
Okay.
It was actually, they were planning to go down to the Hudson River or down by New York, but the seas were so bad they had to turn around and go back up into Provincetown Harbor. That loop right around Cape Cod is where they actually landed. So
thanks for answering that.
Yeah, absolutely. So where was I? What was I?
William Bradford. Who is this man?
Oh, William Bradford.
Who
Yes.
was him?
The talk. It's funny. The talk that presentation I made up there was called "Understanding William Bradford," because he has such a amazing history in terms of his growing up. One simple historical note was that he, by the time he was 20 years old, every 2 to 5 years, somebody significant in his life God removed. He was very well acquainted with death, you might say, in his first 20 years, and it really shaped the way he looked at life. I mean, when he was 1 year old, his father died. 2 or 3 years later, his grandfather dies. Those are the male figures in his life. By the time he's 7, his mother dies, and then he's got his uncles, great uncle, and his uncle, and his grandparents, and then his only sister dies when he's 15, and his last uncle dies at about the time that they were making they were being harried out of England and persecuted for their reformed belief. And they left England to go to Holland and the church lived in Amsterdam for a year and then moved down to Leiden. So for a total of 12 years. So most people don't realize. When I was growing up, I heard that they were persecuted in England and they left and fled and came to America. You know, I didn't even realize that they had actually spent 12 years in Holland and how that prepared them for what they were going to be doing and how God would use William Bradford. So he was the second governor of Plymouth Colony. The first governor, John Carver, died in April, that first winter, after which half their number died. They had 102 passengers and half of them died that first winter. So it's an amazing story of resilience and talk about courage and strength and determination, perseverance, and trust in God, because they talk about very explicitly, and it's beautiful to read his words about why they came. You know, he says he's given these different reasons. He says, lastly but not least, was the advancement of the kingdom of God and sharing the gospel to the native people in this country. So it's really
that cuts a hole right through the atheist and Marxist idea of how America was founded, huh?
It's easy to see how that's one of the things I think that's kind of inspired us to get more involved in making sure we don't lose this history, because you can say it's being rewritten. It's just being actually bulldozed over. It's just, no, that's none of that's true. This is what it is. And that's what people are learning today. It's it hasn't always been that way. So we need to make sure we share the truth. It's the truth that liberates and sets people free. We know that. And it's the lie that enslaves. And we're living through this false news, false history. That's the lie. And lies enslave people. And it's part of what we're trying to, use our time that God gives us to make sure the truth of the gospel and the truth of our history is not lost.
That is awesome. Very well said. I can agree more. Thank you for sharing that. Aaron, if you want to go ahead and kind of share your journey and what you do with our audience.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you. So you heard already about growing up, personal, strong connection with history. I'm also so grateful that my parents took us to the place where history happened, and having a personal connection with history, but then walking in the footsteps of those who've gone before made history intensely personal and very real. So being homeschooled, had that liberty to be able to travel and to read voraciously and just try to soak up as much as I could. However, I also found it so satisfying to be able to share a passion for history with others. And so when I was about 12, 13, started holding Civil War children's reenactments. We go drive around. If I saw a county park and the terrain looked like a certain battlefield from the American Civil War, then I'd study up on the battle, share some history, invite a bunch of friends, and we would reenact these battles. I also joined a living history unit, and I've learned a tremendous amount. There's a gentleman who portrayed a chaplain named Paul Sterrett with his family. Great inspiration. There are also some additional, just real godly men who would take me under their wing and taught me so much. And I enjoyed firing muskets and beating the drum growing up. But one of the most wonderful times were just sitting around the fire at the end of a long day, a long march. We're hot, we're tired, we're thirsty, but you come back, you clean your weapon, you have a good meal, you sit around and just talk history.
That was awesome.
It was profound. There's so much. And then I also volunteered at Fort McHenry for 9 years in Baltimore, the home of the Star Spangled Banner, as it were. And I've learned a tremendous amount from gentlemen there. And I traveled around then to schools with different friends. We wrote a 25-minute long living history play. And so we went to schools and we made history come to life. We made history personal. We made it engaging. And then once my friends went on to bigger and better things, I continued to do that. I developed a 10, basically walked through 10 different time periods of Delaware history, as well as with Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia. We would start with a big old 15-foot canvas map and then have flags and walk through the musical chairs that the different powers played. And like I said, we just walked through 10 different time periods of history. I graduated from the University of Delaware with a degree in history education, then moved down to Virginia, and that was my first full-time job. I worked at a place called Pamplin Historical Park, just outside of Petersburg. So I was able to continue sharing the story of the civilians, but also of the soldiers. And then I met a Georgia peach up there and fell in love, then moved down here to Georgia. So I've been working in Savannah now for a little over 9 years. And I'm now the interpretive supervisor with the Coastal Heritage Society. We operate 6 historic sites in the Savannah area. As you know, Matt, when I met you at Wormslow, I also work part-time as a ranger at Wormslow State Historic Site. And I do a few other tours as well. But about last year, when I got furloughed for 4 months, that was a real wake-up call. And God really opened the doors to begin a business called Liberty Encounters. And so now I offer Colonial Savannah walking tours, also learning adventures at a nearby park on right here in Whitmarsh Island, where we can go through the wooded trails and have a nice 2-acre field. And we reenact the Battle of Cowpens up close to your stomping grounds, I understand, which was a pivotal battle. And some of the Georgia Patriot refugees went all the way up from Georgia and fought at that battle with James Jackson. So we're able to continue this story. And then with Liberty Encounters, I'm also working with the 1620 experience as well. So it's been such a blessing to be able to share God's hand through history, and when you portray multiple eras, you're able, I think, to see the connections. And that's why I'm looking different from how my father's dressed today, because William Bradford, his 4th generation son, was named Thomas Bradford. He was born in 1712, but in 1775, he was a captain in the 4th Massachusetts Militia, and his 22-year-old son named John Bradford was right there with him. So I'm dressed like one of the Minutemen, you could say, who fought at Lexington and Concord in 1775.
And you got your musket. That is awesome.
Oh, thank you. Yes, she's a Shortland Brown Bess musket. The other thing I'll note is that my firstborn son is named William Aaron Bradford, and my second-born named son is John Alden Bradford, because my wife, she had ancestors who also sailed over on the Mayflower too. So my boys have it on both sides. They've got John Alden, the Cooper, who married Priscilla Mullins, and then they've also got William Bradford. And our third son, his name is George, and there was a George Soule who also sailed over in the Mayflower. So
Is John Cooper? He was also like a governor or a leader, right? Or was he? Is he the one that was affiliated with Pocahontas?
oh,
John
well, you
Cooper?
had Captain John Smith. He was
Smith.
actually
John
down in
Smith.
Virginia.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I got
that's
one.
all right.
I got one name
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah, yeah. John Alden, his name was John Alden, and John Alden was a Cooper. So
Oh,
that was
okay.
his occupation. Yes.
Which
What
is
was
a-
it? What's
A barrel maker. He was like
Yeah.
a carpenter, barrel maker. He made the storage things for water and other.
Interesting.
So,
Okay.
how many battle reenactments do you guys do?
Oh, well, back in our heyday, my father and I, we would do probably 12, 14 events a year, but they included full-fledged battle reenactments. We were at the 135th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, which had
Oh, wow.
30,000 troops on the field. And when they had the Pickett's Charge, I've heard that they were 400 men short of an actual full-scale Pickett's Charge.
Whoa.
When I was in the camp on Friday of that reenactment, as far as you could see was just the Confederate cavalry, just walking, marching through the camp on horseback.
Wow. That would really make history be real if you'd see that.
Yeah.
That just gives me chills just thinking about it.
It was always very inspiring. Even we'd go to we'd meet at the beginning of the year and plan on our calendar events, which events we wanted to go to. We also did a federal unit, the 2nd Delaware. We would do not only the reenactments, but we would do living histories where we go and set up an encampment for a weekend, a Friday, Saturday night, or all day Saturday. And people could come by at a mill in New Jersey or somewhere in Pennsylvania. And people would come to these things and we could explain to them what they could ask questions and learn about the history of that particular event or that battle. But like Aaron said earlier, one of the greatest things, the most enjoyable things was at the end of the day, we'd sit together and it was like a seminar. Our captain was just so knowledgeable, Captain Mike Bell from New Jersey, and he would just share, and people would comment on what they knew about different battles, and you could just learn so much and just soak it in. That was the most enjoyable part for me, who, as a little bit older, wasn't as getting out and shooting the musket and marching around all day and sleeping on the ground at night was not the most comfortable, but it was always the most very, very inspiring and just very
There's nothing
very
like sitting.
meaningful.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to mention, Aaron didn't mention it, but he was also one of the core team members for 40 days or something like that when he was in high school for the movie Gods and Generals. So he got to be in
That's a great movie.
a whole bunch of scenes, and it was like that was since
Probably
we were
seen
working,
you. I didn't even know it.
Oh yeah, it was quite and he's been in a number of The War That Made America, PBS documentary, been in a number of films and things, which you can only do those sort of things when you have the flexibility that homeschooling provided for us. So
Yeah.
if anybody's on the fence about that or thinking about it, you won't regret it,
Homeschooling,
especially with what's going on and what's being taught in schools today.
Yeah. That speaking of schools, that's what I wanted to kind of ask you guys next. Do you guys think history, like true history, is the number one thing lacking in schools right now? Like being taught.
Well, I would say there's such a converse from true history. Instead of basically, there are so many lies that are being taught that instead of just not teaching history, they're teaching. I believe that if you look by and large, there's the opposite of true history being taught. There's dishonest and there's untrue history. There are lies, blatant lies are being taught, and that are just really tearing down the very fabric of our country. And I think that's extremely troubling. You can see how far behind we are with other countries when it comes to mathematics and science and this and that. And I know that even recently, being in the education field, there's been a big push towards STEM, your science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so that's very important. We see our crumbling infrastructure, but one of the things I so appreciate about history is that history encompasses so many different fields.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're able to learn about the history of engineering and the history of mathematics, and you can see applications throughout. And so, sure, I'm biased, but I think that history, if you really understand how we got to where we are today, even there's an author named David Macaulay, and he's got David Macaulay, excuse me, but he's got a series entitled The Way Things Work. And so
he's
he
also
goes,
the one that wrote the book 1776. Is that correct?
Oh,
Correct author?
Correct.
that's actually Peter McCulloch.
Oh, okay.
Peter McCullough. David Macaulay, he wrote a book about, for example, pyramids, about castles, and like the Roman cities. And so what he does is through history, he's able to just show so much of science and technology.
Mhm.
So I think if you just have an ignorance, if you are lacking knowledge in how things work, okay, you can see what happened to the Roman Empire. They went from having aqueducts during the Dark Ages, they reverted in a profound, shocking way because they lost so much of that technical knowledge.
Wow.
But just as important, I think, is having an understanding of how we got here, having appreciation for all the sacrifices that went into building what we have. And I'm sure we've all here seen the meme. It's a lot easier to tear things down than it is to build things up.
That's right.
Mhm.
So how can we build up civilization, all the different things that are required to have a healthy civilization, how people
Mhm.
interact with each other. So
Um,
that's a great point, Caleb. Thank you. And I think that is disturbing. I think you make a strong argument that yes, history is lacking in so many ways. And we see all the ripple effects because history, if you break it down, the word history, you can say is his story.
That's right.
Well, whose story is that? It's God's story, the hand of providence. But also, one of the things I've so appreciated about history over the years is that when you make history personal, it's not names and dates. But no, all the things that William Bradford went through, that happened to my ancestor.
yeah.
And he did those things for me. And then from the perspective of 1776, or from the perspective of the Constitution, to secure for ourselves and our posterity
Mhm.
the blessings of liberty, that we were in the mind of those founders of the founding generation when they look back to the Mayflower and they look back to the foundations at Plymouth. They had that in mind when they made those sacrifices that they made, and they showed the courage that they showed to establish the country that we have in 1776 and in the Constitution that we have in 1787 as well.
It's a powerful
It's so
perspective.
profound.
I'd like to just add
Mm.
one thing to that. We talk about, Aaron, you mentioned lies that are being taught. It's important. It's almost like we need to look at that biblically as well, because a lot of lies, they don't just jump off the pages. The big, bold, blatant lies, we can recognize those. But the way Satan works is to provide, a little bit of truth with a lie.
Yeah.
And it makes it harder to discern what's true. So you can introduce some facts that are true. This did happen, but then you take it and say, well, why did that happen? Or this is why people did that. You start imputing motive. It's Tennyson who said, "A lie that is half truth is the darkest of all lies."
That's what happened in
Very
the
true.
garden.
And you have it, yeah, exactly. And I know I always used in my days when I was in the safety field, I used to use a quote from Will Rogers, who used to say, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know that ain't so."
Oh,
Ooh.
And I always found that
That's
to have so many applications, but that is so true today in terms of understanding who we are as a people, who we are individually, and people have gotten to this point today where everybody's truth is equally valid. I mean, it's all based subjectively on experiences, and so you can't argue with somebody's experiences. So that's their truth. Like, truth transcends subjectivity. It's an objective reality that
Mhm.
mirrors reality. And
Yeah.
so, that's a whole area that part of what we're doing in the 1620 experience is looking at how these things really happen, and people need to understand this truth and be exposed to this truth, because if these things happened as they did and they were objectively verified, then that puts into question a lot of these other things that people are trying to get us to accept unquestionably, just, that
Right.
just aren't true.
And if you like, I feel like a lot of people, or I kind of feel like these lies. I don't know how familiar you guys are with the 1619 Project, what they share, and if there's like a couple of lies that you guys could just kind of disrupt or debunk, even right here with the truth that you guys know. But before you do that, I kind of feel like the spirit behind that is to take away the patriotism in people, because if you think that your country's corrupt at its core, then why would you love your country? Why would you want to fight for it? Is that a correct conclusion, I guess, with that?
Absolutely.
I
Our
agree.
first episode, I want just quickly, there are 8 episodes in this miniseries. The first one talks about what it means to be American, what our founders set out. And Aaron, I think as the colonial representative here, what you can do is what we explain is the golden triangle of freedom that Os Guinness talked about. These 3 interdependent, mutually dependent attributes that made America, our founders, which was faith. If you look at a three triangle, there you go, 3-legged stool.
Three-legged stool, yeah.
There you go. Faith, freedom, and virtue were 3 essential, interdependent, mutually dependent factors that if you attack or undermine or any one of those, you're impacting all of them equally. So Aaron, why don't you just explain that a little bit? Because then we go into that, in that same first episode, we say, well, okay, these are important elements: faith, freedom, liberty, and virtue. What does that have to do with the Pilgrims? And that's where I come in. So Aaron, why don't you just touch on that?
If we talk about faith, all right? So faith, you look at the Declaration of Independence, which says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So that is, as we know, a reference to God himself. We appeal in the Declaration of Independence to the supreme judge of the universe, the righteousness of our cause, and there are 26 grievances that are listed in the Declaration of Independence. And even King George is characterized as a prince who is unfit, and is a prince whose character is marked by allowing all these grievances. He is not fit to be a leader. Instead, that's a definition of a tyrant. And if you look in, of course, our Bill of Rights, the very first amendment that we have in our Bill of Rights and our Constitution recognizes our freedom of religion. And so there's that whole idea of, there's a strict wall of a separation of church and state. And so the founders envisioned that if you're in office, then you're to have nothing to do with God's law and with faith and religion and that trust in God. And yet, if you look at the original state constitutions that a lot of the states had, there's a requirement that you believe in God and in the Lord Jesus Christ. And that was
bring that back.
Let's
bring that back.
Yes. Well, it was understood that, yes, and this goes back to the experience that the Pilgrims had. If you've got a state church, the one and only Anglican church, and unless you go to the Anglican church, unless you submit to the different ceremonies, and unless even something as down to crossing yourself, a number of these ministers back in England, if they refused to cross themselves as part of these services, well, then they were not complying. And non-compliance meant that you could be fined and you could be severely persecuted. So we've come so far from not having a state denomination to now with this lie of a separation of church and state, saying that civil government, civil magistrates, states can have nothing to do with God and nothing to do with religion. That just shows you, I think, how far we've come.
Well, Aaron, I think also George Washington was, you think of the founding fathers, you got, Washington and Adams. Washington made that, in his farewell address, made that very important point when he said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. That's that faith leg of the golden triangle. He said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. And John Adams echoed that when he said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So it was very clear that this was the foundational leg that everybody understood.
Absolutely.
That was just the faith leg.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's, I mean, we're seeing it today. We're trying to get God, or people are trying to get God out of everything. We're seeing that this Constitution doesn't work for people that don't believe in God, because like the founders also said, one of the reasons they require people to believe and have a faith in Lord Jesus before they could serve as a public servant was because they said, what meaning does an oath have if you don't believe in rewards and punishments after death? Like, that holds no value. And you're seeing that today, people making an oath and swearing to defend the Constitution from foreign domestic threats, but yet they do nothing because they don't.
Because they're corrupt.
Yeah, corrupt.
Well, and you're right. It gets back to that accountability to somebody other, a higher authority, or somebody other than their constituents. I mean, you've got to have a moral grounding that is based in truth.
Right.
And truth goes back to, I mean, the most powerful and amazing statement in all of Scripture was when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth,
Yep.
and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me." He's the truth. I mean, it gets back to, it's like the word. The word gets back to it all points back to Christ.
Yeah, and it's impossible to look throughout the history of America, the real history, what you guys are sharing, without seeing God in the middle of this and like orchestrating this whole thing. And I believe, like, I don't know if it was some Pilgrims or Founders, that their name for God was like the divine orchestrator of events, and how he just orchestrated the whole founding of America, and just the whole history of America is you can't view it without God in the middle. And so I appreciate you guys bringing that to light, bringing the truth to light.
Preserving that.
Yeah, preserving it, fighting for it. I mean, because truth, freedom, I keep saying freedom doesn't defend itself. We need to defend it, right? We need to preserve it. So
That's
I
right.
appreciate
Well,
it.
and it's necessary. It's freedom. That's what's so interesting about these interdependent attributes. You've got freedom requires virtue and faith, and virtue requires freedom and faith, and faith requires freedom and virtue. They all are mutually dependent upon one another.
And they hold up government.
Yep, freedom
Government can't hold up those things.
Yep.
Yeah, and at the same time, they use the lie separation church and state to get Christianity out of everything, because it's an obvious agenda behind it to get God out of everything. But yet they replace it with their own God, which is an atheistic God, which is actually the state being their God.
Right.
So if they can put their God in, why can't we fight to pull up for our religion, which is what it was founded on?
Yeah. But, it was Benjamin Franklin that really pointed out that essential link between freedom and virtue. We talk about needing virtuous people. He said only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters.
But he was this big atheist and deist. Why would he say that?
Because it's true. It gets back to the these things are immutable. They're truths that transcend people's opinions. They're not subjective opinions. It's the truth of God.
Aaron, it looked like you.
George Mason wrote it. I think of George Mason. He said, "No free government nor the blessings of liberty can be preserved to any people, but by a frequent recurrence to the fundamental principles." And what are the fundamental principles of what it means to be an American? Faith, freedom, and liberty, and virtue. Being a virtuous people.
That's so awesome.
Well, thank you. When I usually, a lot of times in presentations, I will conclude, for example, after I'm able to bring to life the bloodiest 55 minutes of fighting that occurred during the American Revolution, which happened right here in Savannah on October 9th, 1779. A lot of times when I conclude, I will reference that Golden Triangle freedom, and also reference how Benjamin Franklin was asked after he came out of Independence Hall. He was asked by a woman, "Well, what do we have?" And his answer was that we have a constitutional republic, he said we have a republic if we can keep it. And one of my favorite quotes too from Benjamin Franklin is he said that those who are willing to give up their freedom and I usually hold up my bayonet for this, in exchange for temporary security, don't deserve either one.
Mhm.
And yet it takes a lot of courage to live in freedom. It's a lot easier and comfortable to live knowing that, oh, it's not my responsibility to provide for my family and to protect my family. You see that illustrated with the part-time temporary citizen soldiers behind me. They weren't expecting someone else to come and defend them, but as a last resort. And when Captain John Parker stood on the green of Lexington, and it depends on who you read, anywhere from 70 to 77 of those Minutemen, there were upwards up to 700 British who came right up. So being outnumbered 10-1. And the immortal words that Captain Parker uttered to his men were, stand your ground. We don't mean to start a war, but if they mean to start one, let it start here with us today.
Mhm.
And so that freedom requiring courage.
That's
Yes,
courage.
it requires courage to exercise our faith and our trust and our dependence in the Lord. And virtue requires courage. It's a lot easier just to keep our mouth shut. And it's a lot easier to keep our money rather than, for example, giving to those in need. Think of virtue. You think of de Tocqueville. When he crossed America, he was struck in the 1830s just at how generous Americans were and just how freely they gave, how virtuous they were.
Mhm.
And he said, what allows that? Because the size and power and scope of the civil government was a lot smaller than it is today. And the bigger the civil government gets, it crowds out and encroaches upon the lawful jurisdiction of your church government and of your family government. And that's just another thing. What I just wanted to just briefly touch upon as well. You've got your golden triangle of freedom, but Gary DeMar, in his book, God and Government, he referenced how the founders understood that there are God ordained institutions that are beyond just the civil magistrates, just the civil government. You've got the family government, you've got the church government, and you have the civil government. And that's something that the Pilgrims experienced as well. You had the growth of the state church. You had the growth of the civil government that was really, you could say, interfering with what they believed was the church government that was following God, was faithful to God. And you even had an appeal to King James directly after Queen Elizabeth left the throne. King James came along, and some of these reformers, they met King James when he was coming down to London and said, look, these certain things go against our conscience. Could you please basically, give us, or, recognize our freedom to be able to live before God according to such a way? And sadly, James was influenced, and then the civil government was used to persecute and harry the church. So there's always been kind of a friction, you could say. And because power tends to corrupt and power tends to expand, there's always been a battle between what is a lawful authority, what things belong under the family government, what things belong under the church government and the civil government. And all of those governments are subject to God.
That's right.
Which comes from individual government. If you can't govern yourselves when you're in power,
That's right.
then why are you in government? But I love that you point out the different areas of government. I was just reading, I think you mentioned a book. I didn't catch it, but the book I'm reading is God and Government.
That's it.
Yeah, I just read that the other day about the different types of government and how people, when you say government today, they think it's just one government, just a civil government, and how he just explained the different forms. So I really highly encourage that book to listeners and viewers. God and Government by Gary DeMar, I believe. It's like a study, biblical study, historical study, and just how, because God created government in the first place. It wasn't a secular idea. We can go all the way back to Exodus.
Moses.
Yeah. So
yeah, I also have to, being that it's so fresh in my mind and experience, like I said, I was up at Plymouth earlier this week, and Bill Federer, who many of you know through his American Minute that he puts out every day, you can get it free. It just gives you a lot of the, not only American history, but world history. He gave a presentation up there that was just amazing in terms of, it's almost like a condensation of the history of governments in the world and how they all, and it was just so easily explained. And I just can't wait to have him come up here to Delaware and share it with people too, because
What is his? Can you what is his website, or where can you find those?
AmericanMinute.com, I believe, is where you can get him, or if you just Google Bill Federer, that's Federer. He's got little video clips as well of parts of presentations, I think, on his website. So he's a walking encyclopedia of not only American history but world history, but all from a providence from God. He's such a wonderful, godly man, and you will be blessed by reading his books. He's got a number of very excellent books. We've recommended those to people.
Okay, awesome.
Well.
Thanks for sharing that.
Check him out. Yes, absolutely.
Do you guys want to kind of you keep mentioning 1620 experience? Do you guys want to share like the history behind that, how you guys came to do it, and give a little teaser to our viewers and listeners of what to expect?
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching and listening to the interview we did with David and Aaron Bradford. Wow, what incredible content. I hope it inspired you as much as it did me. What they are doing is so vital for the times we live in right now in America. They are preserving our heritage. They are preserving the truth of our foundation, and it's just incredible what they're doing. Stay tuned for next week's video when we will release the second half of this interview, where David and Aaron are going to talk about the TV series, the mini-series TV documentary they are doing called the 1620 Experience. It's really good. It gets you excited, so do not miss it. If you like this video, please share it with someone that you know needs to hear the truth. You can go on YouTube, you can like us, you can subscribe to our page on YouTube, you can go on Facebook, follow us, Instagram, follow us. And if you have not already, you can go to our website at lionsawaken.org, scroll to the bottom of the page, subscribe to our email list where all of our latest content will come directly to your inbox. So thank you so much for watching, and be bold and courageous, because the righteous are bold as a lion. God bless you, and God bless America.